everyone, Catherine Brown here. We are super excited to be coming to you today with a very special guest, Tim Warner, who is a senior content developer with Microsoft and has also been partnering with INE for a series of boot camps recently, is here with us today to sit down and talk with us about the current state of the industry, some real interesting strategies that business can employ as they're moving and migrating into the cloud environment, and some challenges and ways to get past those. So Tim, thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate your time.
Of course, Catherine. Thank you. It's so good to be here with you. I look forward to our discussion.
Awesome. Same here. Before we get into it, Tim, for those who are not familiar with you and your work, want to give a brief introduction. Tim has more than 40 certifications and has written or contributed to more than 30 books, including, as my son was really excited about, Minecraft for Xbox. So he was really excited and stoked that I was going to be talking to you today, Tim. Just an absolute legend in the industry, and really honored to have you here and to have you partnering with INE for these boot camps in the future.
That's very kind. Thank you for all that. Yeah, let's do it. Let's have some fun.
Let's go. Let's go. All right, so I want to jump right in. And first of all, just can you give me a snapshot of your perspective of the state of the workforce and why training is so critical?
Right. Well, of course, with the COVID pandemic, that's kind of kick-started for most businesses, it seems, the movement towards a hybrid work model. And so you've got remote workforce, and that brings in a whole bunch of questions. For instance, how do businesses give their employees secure access to corporate resources? If the business hadn't yet considered a public cloud like Microsoft Azure previously, they would be now. What are their drivers? Well, they're thinking about saving costs, they're thinking about empowering their workforce, and most importantly, it seems, how can they do this migration safely and securely? As you mentioned, Catherine, I come from the combination. My passion professionally has always been the combination of IT with education. So I'm definitely in that camp. But I mean, look here, if you look at the tech news with data breaches happening and software vulnerabilities, and then you combine that with how agile and fast cloud computing works, you have to be, it seems to me, in an eternal student viewpoint anyway if you're going to succeed. It's kind of a roundabout way to say yes, education and continuing education is utterly critical in IT nowadays.
So I want to dig into that just a little bit, because one of the things that I've continually heard from businesses is, proving the ROI on training can be difficult, right? It's difficult to prove that something didn't happen, right? That you were able to prevent something from happening.
Mm-hmm.
So how is the best way to communicate to businesses this critical importance of continuous training and learning for teams?
Mm-hmm. Well, what comes off the top of my head is the recent Log4j vulnerability. Businesses who are blindsided with this are left with the question, how do we be more proactive in understanding this problem? How can we prevent this kind of thing happening in the future? So that's kind of an embarrassing result for a business. A business, by contrast, that empowers their IT staff to stay on top of the technology from day to day, week to week. IT certification is one benchmark. The business may or may not actually have to have their staff certified, but by pursuing IT certifications, that's a way, number one, to have some documentation and validation of the employee's skill set. It's something, frankly, that the employee can take with them to their next job, so it's portable, so there's a what's in it for them aspect as well. And third, just to recur on my theme, when you're studying for these certifications, earning them and then renewing them, you're again forced into an always learning orientation. I hope that made some semblance of sense.
Got it. I think that's really important insight that you're bringing up. Want to follow up with that. As you mentioned, these teams are, the COVID pandemic has kind of forced a lot of teams into this cloud migration. What do you see as some critical must-have skills for teams as they are, continuing to migrate and expand their footprint?
Mm-hmm. Well, I work for Microsoft, and even before I joined Microsoft, I've been a Microsoft specialist for over 20 years, and I've been a generalist, but a generalist within Microsoft Azure over the last several. So I'll limit my discussion to Microsoft. I would say number one, rely on those docs. The Microsoft docs being open source mean that they're really pretty much always up to date and always current. And in the Azure ecosystem specifically, the engineers there have done a lot of work over the last few years to try to simplify as much as you can simplify something as complicated as a migration, but to simplify those options and to kind of unify it. That's called Azure Migrate. So really, I guess my short suggestion would be to take a look at the Microsoft docs in general, and in particular look at Azure Migrate, because that's not only going to give you the lay of the land, what path is best for us. For instance, if we have our on-premises machines, physical and virtual machines, maybe virtualized not only with Hyper-V, but maybe also with VMware. What are the proven practices of that migration path, or virtual desktop infrastructure, or applications, or databases? So you'll find a lot of great guidance and instructions there. There's also a parallel doc set at Microsoft called the Azure Architecture Center. And that's a great spot where you can look at, again, provenly successful migration patterns and pathways, along with topology diagrams. I, for instance, am very much a visual learner, so I love being able to digest a topology diagram and then start to deep dive into the weeds from there. So I think that's a good starting point. And I would also tack on, if a business has compliance and regulatory requirements that they have to keep track of, in Microsoft land, there's the what's called the Compliance Center, or excuse me, it's called the Microsoft Trust Center, and that's an entire web portal with all of Microsoft's regulatory and compliance attestations, and there's lots of great guidance in there to help businesses make sure that as they're planning their migration to Azure, they're staying in compliance with what they need to stay in compliance with.
On that note, we are 4 months into 2022. Um, from your knowledge, your expertise, what are some of the top Azure trends that managers and key decision makers need to be aware of heading into kind of second half of this year?
Okay. To kind of macro out from the largest picture, just industry wide, when I think back over the last decade, right up until the first few months of 2022, I think of the migration, the shift rather, from physical computing to virtual computing. That's been standard now for many years. And then more recently, the trend towards a microservices application architecture, which brings in Docker containers. So I would sum that up in Azure, looking at how do you want to represent your workloads. Maybe right now on premises, your line of business applications are running as clusters of virtual machines, and you can absolutely do what's called a lift and shift and represent that in Azure as virtual machines. But I always challenge customers when I work with them, saying, you have in Azure or any public cloud a whole fleet of platform as a service offerings that enable you to trust the vendor a bit more to take care of the underlying infrastructure, but that also gives you the flexibility and the freedom to focus on the applications and services more granularly, which is ultimately what you want to do. You want to make the customers who are consuming those applications and services happy, you know? So that shift of away from the infrastructure, the virtual machine infrastructure as a service, to start to embrace more of the platform services. Like in Azure, there's App Service, that's the hosted web applications. There's the Azure SQL database products if you're using SQL Server. There's hosted MySQL and Maria. There's Cosmos DB for NoSQL databases. As far as containers, there's the Azure Container Registry for hosting images. There's Azure Container Instances. There's Azure Kubernetes Service. And then to wrap that up in a bow in terms of adopting DevOps and continuous integration, there's turnkey integration with Microsoft's own Azure DevOps platform. And then there's GitHub, which of course, coincidentally, are not Microsoft owns, but they've been around for a long time. There's a lot there for sure. That's an understatement.
A lot to dig into. We are so fortunate to be able to tap into your expertise, Tim, and partner with you. I know you already did one boot camp for INE that's available on the platform now. You have several more coming up. That first boot camp was on infrastructure as code. Can you hit the high points of that boot camp for those who want to maybe didn't catch it live, want to go back and watch it, and then talk a little about what you have coming up and some of the topics that you're going to address in the coming months?
Yeah, Catherine, by all means. This series of 6 INE boot camps I think are very important, and they speak to all the themes that you and I have been speaking to over the last several minutes. You know, trends in IT, decomposed workforce, migration to cloud, proven practices, all of the stuff, all of the above, basically. And so the first boot camp session was on infrastructure as code specifically. So if you go back and watch the recording there, I think that you'll pick up a lot of great value in terms of understanding Git source code control, source code management, how to use it, why it's important. And then there's, what else did we do? We did a lot of work with both Azure DevOps and GitHub Actions so that you'll come away with not only a good appreciation of continuous integration and continuous delivery, but how it actually works. And I know for me, when I was first learning it, it's so important to understand the why. I mean, why am I doing this? And then what does it look like? How does it actually behave? So very, very practical instruction that you can start to apply immediately. Now, the subsequent 5 sessions are going to each take that theme of infrastructure as code, DevOps, CI/CD, and apply it to the different subsystems in Azure. We're going to do a session, I think the next one is on Azure Storage, critically important because a business, if they're going to trust a cloud vendor with their proprietary data, with their customer data, you need to know the tools, you need to know what's your responsibility as a customer versus what Microsoft or your cloud vendor's responsibility is. And then the rest of the sessions, I don't remember all of the titles off the top of my head, but they go into the other major buckets like virtual networking, compute, that kind of stuff. So it's all eminently practical stuff that's right on the leading frontier, so to speak, of IT in the 21st century.
Yeah, and I think that's why we're a really good fit, and this partnership has come together. INE is, of course, all about practical, like instant implementation. So that's awesome to hear. You are an absolute genius in the field. And that next boot camp is coming up in June. You can find details on INE.com or just follow us on social, or Tim, I'm sure you'll be posting about it as well. Before we let you go, anything else that you want to address, talk about, any questions that you want answered or hot topics you want to hit on before we let you go?
I don't think so. I just I want to pass on to the audience something that my grandfather told me when I was very young. He said, Tim, if you can find a job or a career that interests you, sparks your passion to the point where you would do it even if you weren't getting paid to do it, then you've found where you need to be. And I'm grateful that I've found that with the Union of Education and IT, and I wish that for all the audience in their careers.
Your passion is contagious. Tim Warner, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you
You're
in
welcome.
June.
Thank you. Yes, indeed.